Boston, 2005, 3 in the morning. Cold October rain, the kind that doesn't promise anything good, is falling on the sidewalk of Beacon Street. A stranger finds her there, lying on the ground, hair plastered wet against her cheek, left shoulder shattered, forehead bleeding into the gutter. The 68-year-old woman on the pavement is wearing a cashmere coat that cost more than $1,000. When the paramedics arrive, they don't know her name yet. But when the hospital checks her ID, the name stops the room cold. Joan Bennett Kennedy, ex-wife of Senator Ted Kennedy, sister-in-law of the assassinated president. The woman who once stood under the brightest lights in America, dressed in pearls, smiling for 100 million cameras. Now she is alone on a Boston sidewalk, in the cold rain, with a broken shoulder and no one beside her. Her blood alcohol level, measured at the hospital that night, is nearly double the legal limit. And back in her apartment, the apartment she had just stumbled away from the caretaker, finds what Joan had been drinking for months, in secret, without detection, mouthwash, and bottles of vanilla extract, because both contain enough alcohol to satisfy the craving, but neither one smells like liquor. This is the end of a journey that began nearly 50 years earlier, a journey that started not on a sidewalk, but inside a church in Bronxville, New York. On a cold November afternoon in 1958, when a 22-year-old girl in a long-trained wedding dress walked into a world called Kennedy and never truly walked back out again. This is the story of what a dynasty can do to a person when that person is not the heir to its power, but the one given to serve its image. If you've never heard the name Joan Bennett Kennedy, that is precisely the point. Subscribe, so you don't miss stories like this one. By 1958, the Kennedy family was not simply a wealthy family, it was a national project. Joseph Kennedy Sr., the patriarch, the true architect of the empire, had spent 3 decades building it with the cold precision of a military strategist. He made his fortune in the stock market, in Hollywood film distribution, in the Somerset Importers liquor business, after Prohibition lifted his peak wealth, estimated at the equivalent of over $1 billion in today's money. And he had decided very early that money was only the instrument. The real target was political power, and political power needed something that money alone could not directly purchase: an image. That is where the women became indispensable. In the unspoken architecture of the Kennedy dynasty, wives had a very specific function. They were to be beautiful, they were to be present, they were to smile in the right photographs at the right moments, and they were to remain absolutely silent about anything that might darken the luminous reputation that Joseph Kennedy had spent a lifetime constructing. Joan Bennett entered this world, not entirely naive, but without anything close to a map for where she was going. She grew up in Bronxville, New York, in an upper-middle-class household where her mother treated appearances as the highest form of virtue. She was tall, blonde, with the kind of structural beauty that required no effort, so striking that Ted Kennedy's own brother, the future President John F. Kennedy, gave her a nickname. He called her the Dish. She played piano from childhood, gifted enough to later perform with the Philadelphia Orchestra. She read widely. She had depth. But on an October afternoon in 1957, at a building dedication ceremony at Manhattanville College, a 25-year-old man named Ted Kennedy walked through the door, and that 21-year-old girl was never entirely her own again. Ted Kennedy inherited the family's gravitational pull like a birthright. He carried confidence the way only men who have never worried about money can carry it. He pursued Joan with the full force of the Kennedy name, and Joan, like so many before and after her, was drawn into that orbit before she had time to think clearly about what she was agreeing to. November 29th, 1958, St. Joseph's Roman Catholic Church, Bronxville. A long-trained gown, press coverage, both families delighted. And Joan Bennett became Joan Kennedy, a name that would define her completely from that moment forward, whether she wanted it to or not. The early years of the marriage were its most luminous and its shortest. February 1960, their first child, Cara Ann Kennedy, is born. September 1961, Edward Moore Kennedy Jr. July 1967, Patrick Joseph Kennedy. Joan was a devoted, warm, genuinely present mother, more authentically herself in that role than in any other the marriage handed her. But running parallel to that, in those same early years, Joan was learning a lesson no one taught her openly. In the Kennedy family, a husband's infidelity was not a violation of marriage. It was the operating condition of marriage. Ted Kennedy had affairs, frequently, and not with particular discretion within the circles he moved through. Joan knew. She was not protected from knowing. And the expectation around her from the older Kennedy wives, from the culture of the dynasty, was that she would absorb it and continue. A Time magazine piece from that era caught her in a rare moment of unguarded honesty. Of course the stories hurt my feelings. They went to the core of my self-esteem, but no one in the Kennedy world wanted to hear that. The 1960s, for America, were a decade of mythology and blood. And Joan Kennedy lived through all of it, not from a distance but from inside, with no buffer between herself and the full force of what was happening. January 1961, the inauguration of President John F. Kennedy. Joan stands there, 24 years old, in an elegant overcoat, beside her husband, beneath a cold Washington sky. The entire country experiences that moment as something approaching magic. November 1963, Dallas, a gunshot. For millions of Americans, the assassination of President Kennedy is a national trauma, absorbed through a television screen from the safety of a living room. For Joan, it is something experienced in the room itself, as one of the family members required to stand beside the casket in front of an entire watching nation and hold themselves together with a composure that had nothing to do with what they actually felt. She is 27 years old. June 1964. Ted Kennedy is severely injured in a small plane crash in western Massachusetts. The pilot and a Kennedy aide are killed. Ted survives, but spends months hospitalized with a broken back, punctured lung, and fractured ribs. During his recovery, Joan steps in to manage his Senate re-election campaign appearances, keeping the candidacy alive while the candidate cannot stand upright. She receives no public credit for this. June 1968, Los Angeles. A second gunshot. Robert Kennedy is assassinated moments after winning the California Democratic presidential primary. Joan wears black again. Joan stands in the photographs that circle the globe again. Joan keeps her face composed again, because that is what a Kennedy wife does. During this same stretch of years, she suffers multiple miscarriages, losses grieved almost entirely in private, without public acknowledgement, without any support structure within the family capable of meeting her where she was. Each lost pregnancy is swallowed inward and locked away because the Kennedy family had no architecture for that kind of grief. That is when the drinking begins. Not suddenly. It never begins suddenly. One glass of wine before going out to steady the nerves. A drink at the end of a day that had no end. In a social world where alcohol was present at every event, every fundraiser, every Kennedy dinner, it disappears into the background until it no longer does. Ted Kennedy, speaking to the Miller Center in 2006, recalled noticing the first sign during the 1962 Senate campaign. He walked into the room to call Joan for a committee meeting and found her unsteady on her feet. He described it as strange. It was the first time she hadn't been able to make an appearance. That was the 4th year of their marriage, but nothing could have prepared Joan or anyone for the summer of 1969, the night of July 18th, 1969, Chappaquiddick Island, Massachusetts. Joan is not there. She is lying in bed at home pregnant, after 2 consecutive miscarriages, under strict doctor's orders not to travel. Ted Kennedy drives away from a small party on the island, with Mary Jo Kopechner in the passenger seat, 28 years old, a former campaign staffer for Robert Kennedy. For reasons that have never been fully explained to anyone's satisfaction, the car leaves the narrow wooden Dike Bridge and plunges into the dark water below. Ted Kennedy swims to shore. Mary Jo Kopechner does not. What happens in the hours that follow has been examined, debated, and condemned for more than 5 decades. Ted does not call the police. He returns to the party. He goes back to his hotel. Nearly 10 hours pass before a call is made. Mary Jo's body is found the following morning, still inside the submerged car. The medical examiner's findings suggest she died in an air pocket, which raises the question that has never stopped being unbearable. Could she have survived if help had come sooner? Ted pleads guilty to leaving the scene of an accident. Suspended sentence, license, suspension. The Kennedy, legal and political machinery, mobilizes with extraordinary speed. Ted delivers a televised address to the people of Massachusetts, expressing sorrow, asking whether he should remain in office. The response is largely supportive. He stays in the Senate. And Joan, lying in bed, pregnant, already fragile from 2 prior miscarriages, is summoned to play her part. She appears beside her husband in court. She stands beside her husband in front of the press. She dresses in black and attends Mary Jo Kopechne's funeral. Weeks later, she suffers her 3rd miscarriage. Joan Kennedy later told author Lawrence Lima in words that clearly took years to form. For a few months, everyone had to put on this show. And then I just didn't care anymore. I just saw no future. That's when I truly became an alcoholic. That is the most important confession Joan Kennedy ever made. Not about the drinking, about the machine that manufactured it. In the years after Chappaquiddick, Joan seeks help repeatedly. Treatment programs, therapy, periods of sobriety that hold for months before shattering. But the environment she is living inside the Kennedy world, the political world, the relentless public performance of a life that bears less and less resemblance to her actual experience makes sustained recovery nearly impossible. In 1974, she is arrested for drunk driving in Virginia, 6 months without a license. The public gets its first clear view of what the family and those close to her have known for some time. And, according to Lima, when Joan would drink too much at the family compound in Hyannisport, other members of the Kennedy family would point at her and say, "She's a drunk," while holding their own glasses. That is the family whose image Joan had spent her life protecting. In 1979, Ted Kennedy announces his presidential campaign, and Joan, though the marriage is functionally dead, though they have been living separately, since 1977, agrees to campaign for him. Her explanation, offered in various interviews over the years, is both simple and devastating. She wanted to help. She believed in his capacity to serve. And perhaps, beneath that, something else, a hope, however faint it had become, that the campaign might restore something between them that had been gone for a very long time. What happens instead is one of the most painful public spectacles of Joan's life. The press, which had largely ignored her for years, suddenly develops an appetite for her. Every public appearance is analyzed. Every facial expression is studied. When she looks exhausted, it becomes news. When she misspokes, it is amplified. A bumper sticker circulates during the campaign. It reads, "Vote for Jimmy Carter, free Joan Kennedy." Carter wins the primary. Ted loses. The campaign ends and takes the marriage with it. The divorce is finalized in 1982. Carter. Joan leaves with a significant financial settlement and, for the first time in her adult life, an apartment of her own in Boston. She is 45 years old. The years after the divorce are the first time Joan Kennedy lives entirely for herself, and the hardest years in which to do that. She enrolls in graduate school at Lesley College in Cambridge, studying music education. It is a return in some sense to the part of herself that existed before any of the rest of it began. Piano, music. The self that no one in the Kennedy family needed, and therefore no one had bothered to take. She completes her master's degree. In 1992, she publishes The Joy of Classical Music, a guide for you and your family, a small, warm, well-received book, and the quietest possible declaration that a Joan Kennedy exists outside of that marriage, outside of that dynasty, outside of all that tragedy. But the drinking does not release her. The 1990s bring more drunk driving arrests, more treatment stays, more stretches of sobriety that fracture. In 2004, her son Ted Jr. is appointed her legal guardian by the court. In 2005, a stranger finds her on the wet pavement of Beacon Street. She has been drinking mouthwash and vanilla extract. Her kidneys are beginning to fail. And then still one more tragedy in her final years. the kind of loss that no political language is large enough to contain. In 2011, her daughter, Kara, the firstborn child, the one born in the years when there was still some hope, dies of a heart attack. She is 51 years old. The mother outlives the daughter by 14 years, and by all accounts from those who knew Joan during that period, it is the loss she never truly recovers from. She simply continues to exist alongside it. August 2009, Ted Kennedy dies of brain cancer. Joan is present at the memorial services, standing once again in the Kennedy gathering, in the position she occupied for decades. The photographs from that day show her older, quieter, but composed. Always composed. October 8th, 2025. Joan Bennett Kennedy dies peacefully in her sleep at her home in Boston. She is 89 years old. The death certificate lists her cause of death as dementia. Her alcoholism is described as being in remission. Her son, Ted Jr., releases a statement. It contains one sentence worth quoting in full. "I will always admire my mother for the way that she faced up to her challenges with grace, courage, humility, and honesty. She taught me how to be more truthful with myself, more truthful with himself." That is the inheritance Joan Kennedy passes to her son. In a dynasty built on the art of concealment, concealing infidelity, concealing grief, concealing weakness, concealing deaths and secrets and arrangements, the woman considered the most fragile among them is the only one who taught her child that honesty is its own form of strength. There is a question I cannot leave behind when I tell this story. Not the question about Chappaquiddick, though that one remains without a fully satisfying answer. Not the question about the affairs, or the miscarriages, or the years of drinking mouthwash in a locked bathroom. The question is this: what would have happened to Joan Bennett if she had never crossed paths with Ted Kennedy at that building dedication ceremony in October 1957? A girl who played Chopin from memory, a warm voice, an unstudied smile. She might have become a musician, a real one, not in the way of occasional concert appearances with a press caption beneath the photograph mentioning her husband's Senate seat. She might have been known for what she created rather than for whose name she carried. Instead, she became Joan Kennedy, a name the world remembers, a person the world almost never actually saw. Dynasties are called royalty for a reason, and like actual royalty throughout history, the courts built around them always produce their casualties, people consumed by the machinery of a family's ambition and image, without the machinery ever pausing to acknowledge what it has taken. Joan Bennett Kennedy was one of those people. The question is not whether she deserved a different life. The question is whether we ever actually looked at her while she was still standing there, still trying,